Hi. Most granular synths work pretty much the same way. You feed them a sample, they chop it up into small bits or grains. And then those grains get played back either as a lovely cloud texture or a rhythmic pattern through a filter and effects, and that's a good thing. TEMPERA does all that too, but that's not what makes it unique. Rather, it's the way you can lay out those samples on a 2D touch canvas, where you can borrow grains from nearby samples, the fact that different touch points can be set to totally different types of granular playback behavior using color-based emitters. So for example, a blue emitter can be programmed to create rhythmic patterns, while a yellow or red emitter can create a granular texture from the same canvas, all based on which samples you feed it and the various parameters and modulation options for the different emitters. In this video, I'll take a look at what makes TEMPERA special, its workflow in detail, and how it's similar and different from other granular synths. I'll also play you many of its factory canvases at the end. Before I start, a quick disclosure. The company called BeetleCrab sent me TEMPERA. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview of how TEMPERA works as a playable instrument. The principle behind how TEMPERA works is kind of like a string instrument where you need to both pluck or bow a string and place a finger on a fret to play it. With some exceptions, two things need to happen for TEMPERA to make a sound. You need to play a note using an external keyboard or the internal overlay keyboard, and you need to either place one of these colorful emitters or touch the surface to generate an emitter. Without both, you won't hear a sound. So if I, for a second, clear all the emitters that have already been placed on the touch grid, to play, say, an F, I need to both press F and touch somewhere on the surface. I could then play a different note, say a C or a G, and then place my finger anywhere else on the surface, in which case this colorful emitter will start munching on one of the samples previously placed on the grid. Same thing goes for using an external MIDI keyboard. You press a note, select the location on the grid, and it'll start playing. Now you can latch either a note on the keyboard or a location on the grid using the keyboard function. Just press hold, and it will hold a note or more, and then you're free to roam about the grid. And you can also set the emitters to hold or latch onto the grid. Another thing that's interesting and relevant to the 2D canvas is that you can set emitters to borrow grains or borrow samples from nearby samples. This works both on the y-axis and on the x-axis. So my main emitter is in the center and it's not blinking, but the samples it's borrowing from using the spray function can come from any cell below it, to the right and to the left using spray X, and above and below it using spray Y. So in this grid we're mixing different vocal samples, but it could be anything from birds to waves crashing on the seashore, noise, winds, or synths. And emitters don't need to be just smooth granular textures. They can also play grains rhythmically. So let's maybe drop a few of these around the grid and maybe a few of these. So I've got 3 other rhythmic emitters ready and available, playing grains or sample snippets at different rhythms. And don't forget, it takes 2 to make a sound here, so this entire vocal cacophony can also be transposed or played polyphonically using the internal or an external keyboard. I've cleared the grid up a bit. Each of these different color emitters can have different properties, which you can edit in here, and we'll go over these later. You can edit each of these emitters separately. And while there are 4 different emitters, each of which can play at a different rhythm or play a granular type sound, there's no limit to the number of instances that you can place on board of each type of emitter. Behind the scenes, by the way, the grid is arranged in 8 tracks. You can view the samples in each of the tracks in track mode. You can also preview them. Each sample can be up to 11 seconds long, and it's split up evenly across the track. But there's no rule that each sample has to be of the same thing. So for example, this sample is maybe different words, but you could potentially put a different sample in each cell as long as you align them properly in your sample. One more important thing, tracks or samples can be either in bass frequency mode, in which case they'll follow whatever note you play on the internal keyboard, or in bass tempo mode, and for that I'll load up a different project maybe. This I think is a good example. So in this project, all the samples are in bass tempo mode. They can each have their own tempo, but the minute that they're in bass tempo mode, then they will align to the internal tempo of the project. And the result is that if you set them to a rhythmic behavior, then maybe let's turn off the reverb a little bit, you get an entirely rhythmically playable grid. Note, however, that tempo alignment repitches the sample as opposed to time stretches them. So if you change the tempo of the project, samples that are tempo synced will repitch. In this case, by the way, it doesn't matter which note you play on the keyboard. The samples will just play according to the tempo and they won't repitch. This grid also nicely demonstrates one more play mode. Previously, if you remember, I had to select an emitter and then place its color grains anywhere I want on the grid. In this grid, the emitters are set to 2-lane mode, in which case I don't need to select different emitters before playing them. Rather, each emitter will control the 2 columns under it, hence the name 2-lane mode, and you don't need to bother yourself with selecting different emitters in order to use them. So we've seen texture-based emitters, we've seen rhythmic-based emitters. Tempera can also behave kind of like a wavetable synth. There are quite a few factory canvases to get you going. Now typically in these, there's a lot going on, but if I just lower all the emitters but this one, you'll hear that this emitter basically behaves like a wavetable synth, scanning through the various samples on these tracks, turning the canvas into a 2D wavetable synth, where we can activate multiple lanes if we wanted as well. And if you'd like to see the raw samples for this, they're right here, or for this track, and for this track. It's this one. And then one more interesting performance aspect of Tempera, it can have emitters listen to different MIDI channels. So up until now, it's been kind of like a multi-timbral synth, just by virtue of layering different emitters together. But if you want, you can play different MIDI channels using the internal keyboard, so I could have one emitter listen to channel 3 and another to channel 4 and toggle between them here, or say have this keyboard set to channel 1 and the internal keyboard set to channel 2, and set, say, 2 of the emitters to listen to channel 2 and 2 to listen to channel 1, or use, say, a 4-channel sequencer to control each of the emitters separately. Okay, so that was an overview of what TEMPERA can do as an instrument. Let's take a look at some of the details and start with the hardware. In terms of build, it's fairly light, though feels solid. The enclosure is folded metal and the touch grid is fairly smooth to the touch, though you can feel the grooves caused by the brackets. As you can hopefully see on camera, the LEDs on the touch grid and under the encoders are fully RGB, and you can customize them to any color you can pretty much imagine. The encoders are endless encoders. They're not push encoders, but there are 2 buttons under the screens that let you select different options based on the menu you're on. By default, the encoders give you fine selection of parameters, but if you hold this round button, you can change parameters fairly quickly. The grid supports multi-touch, so you can touch multiple cells at a time. The company tells me it's also pressure sensitive technically, but they've not implemented pressure detection or polyphonic aftertouch as of the making of this video, so I was not able to test that. As you may have already noticed, under each encoder we've got an OLED screen with very good viewing angles. Aside from the 2 main parameters, you can choose using the 2 buttons under the screen. Sometimes there are shift functions or additional parameters you can see by holding this little round button, or let's call it the shift button. For example, if I'd like to clear all this mess, that can be taken care of. It's a little hard to see, but other than this round shift button, you've got 2 little arrow keys here, which will let you select sub-pages from within the main pages. And this little tiny dot shows you on which sub-page you are. Or on the track page, you can swap tracks with these buttons. And then these buttons on the right let you choose what main element you want to edit, whether it's tracks, emitters, the onboard keyboard, the 5 modulators and main ADSR envelope, the 4 effects, settings, load and save projects, and macros. The round button or shift button does a few other things, not too many, so I wouldn't call this overly shifty, but say, for example, if you're holding a few notes and you want to hide this keybed, you hold shift and press this button, and you can now access these cells, which you previously couldn't because the overlay was on top of them. It also lets you quickly toggle between editing the different emitters. In terms of connectivity, you've got an SD card slot on the front to expand the internal storage, and then on the back you've got 2 1/4-inch outputs, one of which doubles as a headphone jack. Then there's a single 1/4-inch stereo input for sampling. TEMPERA samples in stereo and its grains are in stereo too. Then there's a USB Type-A port for additional storage or connecting MIDI controllers, and a USB Type-B port for connecting to a computer for MIDI and data transfer onto the SD card. You can't, however, send audio back and forth over USB, nor can you power TEMPERA over USB. It can only be powered using the included power brick. Then you've got TRS MIDI in and out, which can be configured both as Type A and Type B, which is great. And TEMPERA also has a built-in microphone you can use to sample into its tracks. Then to complete the overview, just a few specs, you can load or record samples that are up to 11 seconds long per track for each of the 8 tracks, which is a bit limiting, though you've got a total of 8 gigabytes of internal storage for projects or canvases as they're called here. And because the total sample size you can load up here isn't too big, several dozen megabytes, you can probably store over 100 projects just on the internal memory, and a cheap SD card will take you quite a bit of time to fill up. Projects load up fairly quickly, and there are relatively smooth transitions between projects, depending on what's in a project. When it's loading, you'll see these LEDs blink. Anyway, projects take only a few seconds to load, so you won't have to come up with jokes while swapping projects in a live show. According to the company, TEMPERA can play a total of 4,096 grains, which is probably more than you'll ever need, and it's got headroom up the wazoo to deal with that, up to 10 volts peak to peak, so be careful with levels using the volume control. And it can play up to 16 voices or notes at a time, though depending on how you define a voice, you can get more by playing individual emitters, especially if you have a friend over or use your feet, because You can put quite a few of these on the touch grid. Like I mentioned earlier, you can call this multitimbral because you can create layers with multiple emitters or splits with multiple MIDI channels. But some elements are shared, for example, the master effects and the ADSR envelope, it and the 5 modulators are global. Okay, let's dive into the details and take a look at the different menu options when controlling each of the different aspects of TEMPERA. I'll start with a track menu on top and work my way down. This is the word salad project we saw earlier, so plenty of vocal samples here. And there are a few of these. We won't listen to all of them. Obviously, you can load up your own samples if you like from the internal storage, the SD card, or a USB drive if you want. You can also control track levels using the track menu. You have to switch between tracks to control the pairs of tracks. And other than loading tracks, you can, of course, also sample or record into any one of the tracks. In order to do that, you need to set the recording settings in the settings menu. There's an instrument level input, and you can resample the output of TEMPERA. Use the line in, input in the back, in mono or stereo, and sample using the internal mic. I could set threshold, testing, 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 threshold, threshold, pass the threshold. And I'm pretty far from it now, so I'll get closer to record. I can monitor recording if I want. And this is pretty important. Replaces what you want to do if you want to erase the previous track, but you can also overdub, meaning combine incoming audio with whatever you're recording, and mix the two, which lowers the level of the pre-recorded audio. And I could also change the gain if I wanted. 1, 2, 3. So let's record something. I'll go back to the track menu and say arm track 3 to record. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now you may have noticed I didn't time my recording 1 per cell. 2, 3, 4. But I can go ahead and trim the sample, trim the start point and the end point. And you'll notice that as I shrink this, and I can move fast by holding the round button, you can see the little grid, the cell grid lines help me align to cells more or less evenly. There's no way to zoom, unfortunately, so I'll just hope for the best. Let's trim and see what happens. Let's go back, play. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I can now export this as a FLAC file or, say, reverse it if I wanted. And there's a normalize feature too. Let's not do that. And go back. And as you may remember, there are 2 modes for tracks. I'm going to leave it in frequency mode, but if I wanted to play this rhythmically, then I could change it to bass tempo. And there's also a detect option here, both for tempo and for frequency. Tempo alignment here, by the way, isn't a time stretch. What it's going to do is just repitch the sample up or down, play it faster or slower to align with the project's tempo. And one more thing to mention before we leave the track menu, while samples can be only 11 seconds long, you can load a snippet from samples that are up to 5 minutes long. Okay, let's move on and talk about emitter settings, which you can change using the emitter button. Let's check out which parameters we've got to play with. 1, 1, 1. Grain length. You see these little brackets here. 1 means that we're listening to 1 or 2. But what it means is we're playing a grain that's 1 cell long. So I could make it longer and then play 2 and 3, or make it way shorter and get granular. And then, of course, start launching more grains and then travel through the grains. 2, 3, 4. And notice how the emitter is leaving home base here. 6, 1, 2, 3. You can't automate this travel currently directly from this menu, but you can using a modulator. I'll show you that in a bit. Anyway, so that's grain length. And there's jitter, which can add some randomness there. And if you want, you can also set grain length by note size. So this will be quantized to the project's tempo, which is very useful for beats. And then grain density can get very high. And then finally, you can also tempo sync the triggering of the grains. So when grain trigger is all the way to the left, grain density determines how frequently grains will be triggered. 1, by the way, means just the length of the grain. So at around 1, you'll get 1 full grain, and if you go higher than 1, the grains will start to overlap. Anyway, if I move it all the way to the right, then we'll get tempo synced grains. And of course, there needs to be some external or internal beat going to realize that it's linked to the internal tempo. And the nice thing is that you can crossfade between trigger rates that are based on time and trigger rates that are based on whatever the grain density is. So that's an interesting effect. So that's page 1. Let's take a look at page 2 of emitter parameters. Spray Y will start stealing from nearby cells. And a line will align it directly to the start of the cell, which is useful in this case. This is cool. Anyway, that's spray Y, and spray X will start stealing grains from nearby tracks. Remember, this canvas is full of vocal samples, so we start stealing words from nearby tracks. Anyway, that's spray X and spray Y. We already talked about relative Y. Let's scan back and forth, and I think I need to turn off a line for this to sound good. Yes. 3, 4, 5. So this is our good old time stretch. 1, 2, 3. And relative X will change our relative bass point as far as the track is concerned. Now you'll notice this doesn't move between tracks smoothly, so there's no crossfade between tracks here. But I think with spray X, we'll get a smoother transition between the tracks. Anyway, let's keep on moving down the menu pages. You've got a grain envelope to a smoother envelope, and one which is better suited for, again, beats or rhythmic grains. Tone control, which is like a filter, DJ filter and width. And then panning, with jitter for panning. Which is cool. So you make the grains a bit longer. Sweet. And then, you know what, let's not make them that big. Then there's tuning. So there's 3 options here. Slight detune, or extreme messy detune, and snap to fifths, or snap to eighths, octaves, or both. That's pretty nice, I think. And then you've got a general octave transpose, individual send to the effects, to all of the effects on a per emitter basis. You can change the emitter's name, and then you've got a few placement options. So I've not been using 2 hands because I've had this on toggle mode. In instant mode, it will only stay for as long as I touch the grid. Toggle will toggle placement. Then there's latch mode, which works kind of like an arpeggiator. So you can drop one and it will replace the other, and then drop a few and then replace them. And then lock will prevent other emitters from overriding these, and 2-lane is that mode which I discussed earlier, where each of the 4 emitters can get its 2 dedicated lanes, and you can activate this on a per emitter basis if you like. What else? There's one more page, global channel, that sets the channel that this specific emitter listens to, so you can have each emitter listen to different channels, say this one to 6, this one global, this one to 3, and so on. Note that this will no longer listen to the keyboard unless I set the keyboard to channel 3 or listening to global. And then there's fade in and fade out, which is an envelope for the placement of emitters. So we'll talk about the general envelope soon, but currently 0 fade in means this plays immediately, but if I increase fade in, then it will slowly fade in and obviously slowly fade out as well. Okay, let's turn these down and move on to the keyboard menu. This addresses the keyboard overlay, so I can transpose it down if I want, or up, set its MIDI channel, the channel it's playing to, set its scale. There's bass note, which means all of them play the same note, major, minor, and chromatic or piano style. And then since the presence of this keyboard prevents you from accessing the emitters under it, you have a few options, putting it to the right, to the left, and top or bottom. If you don't need to touch the emitters, if you already have them set up, you can get 2 octaves in chromatic mode or 4 octaves in scale mode. You can hold notes. And the nice thing is you can also play on top of held notes in this mode, and to unhold notes, either press them again or just hold clear. So that's pretty much it for the keyboard. You can hide it if you want, so the note will keep playing, but you can't unlatch it unless you bring back the keyboard. And let's move on to the modulators. As I mentioned, there are 5 modulators and a single global ADSR amplitude envelope. So we can slow the attack if you want. There's decay and sustain levels, and of course release. So that's the main ADSR envelope. And then we've got 5 identical modulators. These can be either LFOs of various shapes, sine, triangle, square, saw, noise, which is random sample and hold, and there's a slow noise. You can also access the mod wheel of an external keyboard, or aftertouch, not poly aftertouch currently, of an external keyboard. And you've also got an AD, attack decay envelope, and attack release envelope. So I promised you earlier that we would modulate relative Y. We can use any modulator for that. Let's go maybe for a triangle modulator. Set the target to relative Y of emitter 4. That's the emitter that we were editing. Let's make it a really slow speed, change the mod depth. And you can see it here. Scan the sample back and forth. Back and forth. So maybe start here. Then we can, of course, play with the emitter, say, edit the grain length, grain density. But that's our modulator, basically, modulating relative Y in this case. And we could modulate, of course, any other parameter that's available in the destination list. So we could go to modulator 2 and then choose, a different target. And those are basically the modulators. Let's move on and take a listen to the effects. Let's go with filter. There's a filter with resonance. Few filter types, including a formant filter and key tracking for the filter. Then we've got a chorus effect. Let's maybe choose a different sample. So chorus. And then a delay. With a few types. No pong. And with pong, always better. Nice frequency control with color. And then we've got a reverb. Again with color control. And size that can go to almost infinity. So those are the effects. These are master effects, except for the filter, which is per voice. And let's move on to the settings. We already talked about the recording settings when we sampled audio into one of the tracks. Let's take a look at the other settings. Typical stuff you'd expect. MIDI type, which I mentioned is pretty cool. The touch grid isn't velocity sensitive or pressure sensitive, at least currently, but when you use an external keyboard, Tempera does respond to velocity. So you've got a few curves for that, including fixed if you want to ignore velocity from an external keyboard. A few other settings, and I think that's pretty much it. Next up, we've got the load save menu. Before that, shift and load save menu is a quick save for the current project. Anyway, the load and save menu will, as the name implies, let you access the flash drive if one is plugged in. It's not, so this is grayed out. The SD card, which is here. The user and system folders on the internal drive. So for example, these are all the factory sounds. These are in folders. So for example, there's a fiction folder, and in that a horrific canvas, which sounds appropriately horrific. And I'm sure the nightmare one also doesn't pull any punches. Anyway, that's the load save menu. This is just for projects. Remember, for samples, you'll need to go into edit and then load samples. Same goes for saving or exporting samples that you recorded. So this is just for projects. And then there's the macro menu. What this does is give you quick access to parameters that may be hidden in menus. So for example, in this factory project, we've got access to the filter and resonance and reverb size and reverb mix. And there's a second row of quick access parameters. I think I've stuck myself into a horror corner. Let me clear all the notes. Anyway, if I wanted to, say, start with an empty canvas, then this is what you get by default, which is nothing. But then say if I wanted to go to emitter 3 and edit it and say choose relative Y as one of the macros, then you long press this button, turn the knob, then when you leave it, it will ask you where you want to place the macro. So let's say place it here, and now we're controlling relative Y of emitter 3 using this encoder. So that's how you assign macros. You can't control more than one parameter at once with this function, but you can assign more than one parameter per encoder and swap between the two. So let's say I want to assign spray X also to this encoder, but on page 2, I'd navigate down to page 2, press here, and now I've got spray X controlled on this page and relative Y controlled on this page. One final noteworthy aspect of Tempera, BeetleCrab, the company that makes it, is facilitating a canvas gallery where anyone can upload and share canvases, which is a very nice thing to do for their community. Then one more miscellaneous item, Tempera has a comprehensive MIDI control implementation. Using MIDI CCs, you can send it to trigger cells on the grid or edit parameters. So if you want to access more than 4 parameters at a time, you can do that with an external controller. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Tempera. On the pros side, what makes it special and a different kind of instrument, I think, is the sum of its parts. The combination of a 2D canvas of samples, the ability to easily play any location on those samples with different granular emitters or playback styles, including grain clouds and rhythmic patterns by just touching the different locations on the canvas or different samples under them, along with the ability of each emitter to grab samples to the left, to the right, above or below it, along with the fact that you can repitch the entire canvas or parts of it on different channels, whether using the internal overlay keyboard or an external controller. It just feels like an instrument, and in that regard, I don't think there's anything like it. There are, however, a few alternative options that do slices of what TEMPERA can and some other things that it can't. For example, the excellent iPad app Borderlands Granular also lets you create a 2D canvas of samples and drop emitters on that can grab audio from one or more samples like TEMPERA. And you can also tempo sync emitter grains, as with TEMPERA, but as far as I know, while you can pitch its different emitters, it doesn't allow you to play the canvas or parts of it chromatically with MIDI or a controller. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. Then there's Plinky, which also lets you set up a 2D canvas of samples and swipe your fingers across it to play them. And it's pressure sensitive too, something that isn't implemented in TEMPERA, at least not yet. But you can't play its grid chromatically in the granular mode, unlike its synth or sample modes where you can, and it's much more limited in terms of the number of grains, voices, storage, and it doesn't support multi-touch in a single column like TEMPERA does. It's still a lot of fun and less expensive than TEMPERA, just different, but certainly worth a look. Then there are plenty of other granular synths that don't have this concept of multi-touching a point in one or more samples at a time, but still let you load up samples and extract grains from them and play them chromatically. Synths like Lemon Drop by 1010 Music, GR1 from Tasty Chips, and on the higher end Iridium from Waldorf, just to name a few. While these don't support this multi-touch, multi-sample concept, they may tick more boxes in terms of features. For example, you can't use TEMPERA as a real-time granular effect. While you can sample in real time while other things are going on, you can only start to apply granular effects to that sample after it's in the memory. Also, some others let you load up samples that are longer than 11 seconds, have more effect types like distortion, which would be nice here. Also, the resolution of this grid is only 8x8. There are no in-between points. So if you want to smoothly scan across samples, you can do that by either turning the relative Y knob, using internal modulation, and maybe pressure if that's added in a future firmware update. On the firmware wishlist side, TEMPERA doesn't support polyphonic aftertouch or MPE, which would help in making it a more expressive instrument, and it also doesn't let you apply the effects per emitter other than using the general effects send. It would also be nice to be able to create manual slice points between the different cells, or just load up samples into cells as opposed to a single sample per track. And then finally on my wish list, it would be nice to be able to reverse the individual grains as opposed to the entire track, and some form of either a simple arpeggiator, sequencer, or motion recorder that would let you record what you play and what you touch on the grid, and then play with various parameters as that plays back, kind of like a MIDI looper for whatever is going on with the touch grid, I think would be really useful here. Also, there's no Easter egg Tetris mode, which I think is a must. Despite that, while TEMPERA doesn't have the longest granular feature list out there, what makes it shine is how its controls, multi-touch canvas approach, and design come together as its own unique and innovative instrument. I'm going to keep it handy because I don't think anything I have does what it can, and it complements the setup very nicely. That's it for now. Stay tuned for the factory canvases, and if you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.